The moment the kind widow stopped to help a seemingly stranded man with a flat tire, she sealed her fate. She offered him water, completely unaware that this polite stranger was actually the most feared angel of hell. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'll pay back your kindness 1,000 times over," he whispered, his eyes blackening as she instantly felt a chilling darkness grip her soul. What this angel wanted in return was more terrifying than anything she could imagine, and the price was due. Immediately, the clock, for Agnes Miller, was a helix of quiet decay. Widowed woman. Who counted pennies, she lived beneath the frigid shadow of an eviction notice, confined to a cabin that groaned with every whisper of the desert wind. Her husband, Thomas, had carried into his grave not merely love, but the very marrow of financial stability, the whispered promise of a tranquil future. All that remained was a dilapidated landau, its engine a chorus of complaints, the last bastion against total collapse. It had been her final tether to freedom, and when it gasped its last breath in the opaque gloom of a moonless night, she knew the end had arrived, not with a shriek, but with the resigned silence of a broken engine. The place where it sputtered to a halt was no service station, but a desolate stretch of State Route 49, the rusted remains of an abandoned truck stop, an open-air museum of hopes lost and forgotten. Fear materialized in leather and shadow. The man who dismounted from their customized motorcycle seemed to have been carved from the very fabric of darkness, his presence bordering on the supernatural. His face, etched by time and by scars that spoke volumes of violence and betrayal, betrayed a restless soul. He was Kane Ryder, known in shadowed circles by the chilling epithet Phantom, a name earned by the lethal efficacy with which he vanished. Agnes was oblivious that she stood before a grim reaper in flight, the leader of a motorcycle club that reeked of gunpowder and spilled blood, embroiled in a brutal schism with his own brothers of the road. He was no ordinary patron, but a fatal crossroads. His engine roared with the agony of a complex defect, yet Agnes, with the stubborn dignity of one who had nothing left to lose, approached him. Her father, a former stock car racer from a bygone era, had taught her the raw language of engines, the intimate secret of flooded carburetors. She did not help him out of bravery, but from a residual impulse of human decency, an act of kindness in the epicenter of decay. She laid her hands on the grease and metal not with trepidation, but with the familiarity of one who had already faced life's brutal machinery and lost. Kane's gratitude was a heavy silence, followed by the cold weight of crumpled bills tossed into her hand, money bearing the indelible mark of the grime and violence he embodied. It was enough to stave off the imminent disaster for a few weeks, a lifeline that, in truth, was the very rope pulling her towards the abyss. Scarcely had she reached the precarious safety of her cabin when she sensed the gaze. A black utility vehicle, with thick tinted windows, crept past, its headlights licking at her soul, observing her every movement. Hours later, Kane's voice, gravelly, cold and merciless, resonated from a burner phone he had compelled her to accept. He needed no pseudonyms. He was simply Kane. The message was unequivocal, a verdict. By touching him, she had become a living piece of evidence, a loose end his enemies would surely track. Henceforth, she belonged to his web of secrets, her sole and perilous anchor of security. The law's intervention was a theater of anguish. Detective Harding, the weary-eyed skeptic, and Detective Rourke, the more empathetic, subjected her to a discreet interrogation in a windowless room. They divulged the biker's full name, Kane Phantom Ryder, the architect behind a nefarious operation that trafficked stolen luxury vehicles and masterfully forged identities. Her association was a crime by contamination. The danger swiftly escalated beyond hollow threats, materializing in the decaying diner where Agnes served cold coffee, and the only sound was the hiss of the fryer. The rival gang, the savage Ironhounds, confronted her in the grimy kitchen. The warning they delivered, whispered with metallic breath and smoke, spoke not of money or loyalty, but of a daughter, Clara, Agnes's teenage girl, whose sole dream was to flee that town. Clara's life was the price for Kane's ledger. Clara's fear was the catalyst. The police were slow, bureaucratic, and ineffective. Kane was immediate and lethal. The moral choice dissolved into the pragmatic necessity of survival. It was not a question between good and evil, but between a failing system and a demon who promised instant protection. Agnes took Clara, and their lives became a frenetic series of stops and starts under Kane's cold guidance. They hid in an isolated cabin, nestled deep within an unnamed, dense forest, the sole witness to Kane's confessions. He was not merely a fraudster. His operation was an intricate scheme of pension fund diversion, using falsified identities, a crime that destroyed lives from the inside out, eroding the very foundation of society. He did not deny the blood on his hands, and Agnes knew she was protecting a predator. Yet he was protecting her too. The hesitation to betray him was a moral weight that consumed her, a visceral conflict that bound her to the criminal. The end arrived in the form of a nocturnal meeting on the outskirts, beneath the heavy shroud of light pollution, not in a warehouse, but in an old, abandoned grain silo, an empty temple of dust and regret. Kane, the Phantom, orchestrated the decisive moment with his former leader, Brock. The offer was a digital ledger, the map to the illicit empire he had helped construct, in exchange for the freedom of Agnes, Clara, and himself. Betrayal, however, was the only true currency. The confrontation was not graphic, but the implicit violence filled the air with an unbearable weight. Kane had anticipated the breach of the truce. The escape was not dignified, but desperate, through the sewer drainage system beneath the silo, a fetid path that crushed the last vestiges of their humanity. They emerged under the cold moonlight, exhausted, climbing into the old landau Agnes had repaired. In the distance, they watched the smoke ascend. Not only the silo, but the isolated cabin, all their traces, had been purged. The widowed woman and the criminal, along with the daughter, were now permanently adrift, condemned to eternal flight, pursued by all, the police, the iron hounds, and the spectre of their own choices. The desert wind, a tireless sculptor, had for decades etched the narrative of Agnes's existence into the parched earth around her. It was a story told in the groaning timbers of her cabin, in the rusted skeletal remains of the truck stop, and in the silence that followed Thomas's passing. Every sunrise had been a fresh testament to her solitude, a canvas painted in the muted hues of resignation. Yet, within that quietude, there resided a dormant resilience, a hidden wellspring of mechanical intuition inherited from her father, a man who spoke the language of engines as fluently as he did the language of love. This inner dialogue, a constant assessment of systems and their failures, had become her unspoken survival protocol. Her competence with the landau, a machine long past its prime, was not merely a skill but a ritual of emotional maintenance. Each oil change, every spark plug replaced, was a small act of defiance against the larger forces of entropy threatening to consume her. The vehicle was a metaphor for her life, battered, neglected, but stubbornly refusing to yield. The desert, unforgiving and vast, mirrored her own internal landscape, a place of scarcity, but also of stark, undeniable beauty. She understood its harsh rhythms, the way life clung to existence despite the odds, much like the brittle desert flowers that bloomed after a scarce rain. This understanding had honed her observational skills, not just of nature, but of human nature. She saw the minute cracks in facades, the tells in body language, the unspoken narratives that people carried like burdens. When Kane, the enigmatic Phantom, had first roared into her life, his presence had been a violent disruption of this carefully constructed solitude. His motorcycle, a gleaming beast of chrome and power, had seemed an extension of his own raw, untamed essence. Agnes, however, saw beyond the aura of menace. She saw the engine struggle, recognized the mechanical distress that transcended his hardened exterior. Her intervention wasn't an act of naive compassion, but a detached assessment of a failing system, a mechanical problem that she possessed the specific, practical knowledge to rectify. Her father's lessons echoed. Identify the malfunction, apply the correct solution. It was a protocol that bypassed fear and focused on efficiency. The money Kane had thrown at her, a transactional gesture cloaked in contempt, was a momentary reprieve, not a blessing. It merely bought her more time in the precarious dance with eviction, yet it was the subsequent events, the creeping black SUV, the chilling phone call, that fully yanked her from her static existence into a dynamic, perilous narrative. She was no longer an observer of her own slow decline, but an unwitting participant in a brutal high-stakes game. Kane's declaration, "You are a loose end," wasn't just a threat. It was a cold, hard truth, articulated by a man who understood the meticulous architecture of danger. Her competence had rendered her visible, a critical component in a system she never asked to join. The arrival of detectives Harding and Rourke further solidified her entanglement. Their probing questions, their clinical dissection of Kane's criminal empire felt less like an investigation and more like an indictment by proxy. Agnes, accustomed to silence and self-reliance, found herself navigating a labyrinth of legal and moral implications she had no training for. She recognized the pattern. The system, vast and impersonal, was dissecting a situation into data points, indifferent to the human cost. She was a statistic, an unfortunate collateral, much like the forgotten artifacts at the abandoned truck stop. But unlike those, inanimate objects, Agnes was acutely aware, meticulously observing, processing every detail. Her time in the diner, serving lukewarm coffee to transient faces, had been another crucible for her observational skills. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in expressions, the telltale gestures of desperation, anger or fear. So, when the Firecuss Iron Hounds BI materialized in her greasy kitchen, their presence an immediate and palpable threat, Agnes registered the danger not through raw panic, but through a series of micro-observations. The way their eyes scanned the room, the controlled aggression in their stance, the specific guttural tone of their voices when they spoke of Clara, these were all behavioral cues she processed with an almost clinical detachment, a mechanism for survival forged over years of quiet vigilance. The mention of Clara, however, cut through her practiced emotional distance. It was not merely a threat, it was an activation of her primal protective instinct, a violation of the unspoken boundary around her daughter's fragile hope. Clara, with her dreams of escape, represented the last flicker of a future unburdened by the desert's relentless grip. The dilemma was stark and unforgiving. The law, with its slow gears of justice, offered no immediate shelter for Clara. Kane, a force of immediate and destructive power, offered protection, albeit at a terrifying cost. Agnes, the widow who had learned to repair broken machines and navigate the subtle currents of human despair, understood the brutal efficiency of a direct solution. Her choice was not one of virtue versus vice, but of pragmatic survival for the only person who mattered. It was a choice rooted in a deep, intuitive understanding of relational systems. Protect the vulnerable even if with a devil. It was a strategy born not of despair, but of a calculated assessment of immediate threats and available resources. She had always fixed what was broken, and now Clara's future was the most vital machine needing repair, even if the tools were tainted. The desert, a silent accomplice, watched as Agnes and Clara packed their few belongings. The landau, once a symbol of her husband's lingering presence, now transformed into a vehicle of desperate flight. The air, heavy with the scent of sagebrush and impending change, carried the unspoken weight of their new reality. Agnes moved with a focused intensity, her movements precise, methodical, stripping away sentimentality for efficiency. Each item chosen, each decision made, was a micro-act of survival, observed by Clara with a mixture of fear and a fragile, nascent trust. Clara, accustomed to her mother's quiet resilience, now saw a different facet, a raw, unyielding force emerging from the depths of her grief. This was not the Agnes who baked bread or hummed old tunes, but a woman forged in the crucible of necessity, her emotional systems recalibrated for threat assessment and protection. Their journey began under the veil of twilight, the landau rattling a discordant rhythm against the silent hum of the desert. Kane's instructions, relayed through the burner phone, were terse, devoid of empathy, yet remarkably effective. He spoke in codes of directions, landmarks and timings, a language of clandestine movement. Agnes, listening intently, translated his harsh commands into a sequence of tangible actions, each turn of the wheel a testament to her newfound resolve. The landscape blurred, a canvas of shadows and fleeting lights, each mile separating them from their former lives, pulling them deeper into Kane's dangerous orbit. Clara, huddled in the passenger seat, watched the world recede, her dreams of escape now an ironic reality, twisted into something far more perilous than she had ever imagined. The silence between mother and daughter was thick with unspoken fears and the chilling understanding of their new, shared vulnerability. Agnes, behind the wheel, felt the familiar vibrations of the Landau's engine, a grounding presence amidst the chaos. She had always found solace in understanding how things worked, in the predictable logic of mechanics. Now, she sought to apply that same analytical rigor to their predicament. Cain, for all his menace, was a system, a complex, dangerous one, but a system nonetheless. His motives, his methods, his vulnerabilities, these were the new gears she had to learn to read, to anticipate, to perhaps even manipulate. Her father had taught her that every machine, no matter how powerful, had its breaking point, its inherent flaw. Cain, the formidable phantom, was no exception. The isolated cabin deep within the nameless forest was an incongruous sanctuary. Its rustic exterior belied the tension that permeated its every beam and plank. Here, away from the constant surveillance of the desert roads, Agnes found herself in closer proximity to Cain, a proximity that forced a new kind of interaction. He was a creature of the shadows, accustomed to distance and command, but the confines of the cabin stripped away some of that anonymity. She observed him, not with judgment, but with the detached curiosity of a mechanic studying an unfamiliar engine. His guarded expressions, the subtle shifts in his posture when he spoke of his operation, the flicker of something almost human in his eyes when he glanced at Clara, these were the micro-expressions, the non-verbal cues she had honed her entire life to detect. His confessions, delivered in fragmented, almost reluctant sentences, painted a chilling portrait of his empire. The diversion of pension funds, the falsified identities, the systematic dismantling of lives from the inside out. It was a crime of insidious design, far more devastating than the violent encounters he was known for. Agnes, who had seen the slow, grinding decay of financial ruin firsthand, understood the profound damage he inflicted. It was not merely theft, it was the theft of futures, of security, of the very bedrock of existence for countless individuals. The blood on his hands, as he acknowledged, was not just from physical altercations, but from the invisible wounds he inflicted on society. Yet, even as she absorbed the chilling truth of his depravity, Agnes couldn't ignore the paradoxical reality. He was also their protector. His ruthlessness, his intimate knowledge of the underworld, his capacity for immediate, decisive action, these were the very qualities that currently shielded them from the dangers he himself had created. The moral weight pressed down on her, a constant gnawing conflict. To betray him was to expose Clara to immediate, unimaginable peril. To protect him was to become an accomplice, to taint her own soul with the grime of his transgressions. It was a choice that transcended simple binaries of good and evil, forcing her into a nuanced landscape where survival dictated morality. She, who had always valued integrity and decency, was now tethered to a man who embodied their antithesis. Clara, meanwhile, found herself caught between two terrifying figures, the shadowy phantom and her newly hardened mother. Her youthful optimism, her yearning for a normal life, clashed violently with the brutal reality of their existence. She watched Agnes with a mixture of awe and apprehension, sensing the profound transformation unfolding within her. The quiet strength she had always known was now imbued with a fierce, almost primal protectiveness. Clara, too, was learning to read the shifting currents of their new reality, to discern the subtle cues of danger, to understand that survival in this world required a constant state of vigilance. The silence between them, once comforting, now held the unspoken anxieties of their shared ordeal, a silent pact of endurance. Agnes, aware of Clara's fragile state, sought to create pockets of normalcy, small rituals that affirmed their bond amidst the chaos. She mended Clara's torn jacket with a meticulous hand, her needlework a physical manifestation of her desire to repair the fraying edges of their lives. She cooked simple meals over a sputtering fire, the scent of wood smoke and simmering food, a momentary comfort in the desolate cabin. These were not grand gestures, but concrete actions, protocols of care that spoke louder than any words. She demonstrated, through her steady hands and unwavering presence, that even in the heart of the storm, The architecture of their relationship remained intact, a small but unyielding sanctuary. The desert wind continued its mournful song outside, a constant reminder of the vast, indifferent world beyond their temporary refuge. But inside, a different kind of wind was blowing, a storm of moral reckoning for Agnes, a tempest of lost innocence for Clara, and for Kane the Phantom, a reluctant confrontation with the humanity he had long abandoned. The cabin, a crucible of their intertwined fates, held them captive, forcing them to navigate the treacherous currents of trust and betrayal, of fear and a strange, desperate alliance. Agnes knew that their time here was borrowed, a brief interlude before the inevitable escalation. The delicate balance she sought to maintain between protecting her daughter and confronting the monster they harbored was a system under immense pressure, teetering on the brink of collapse. Her analytical mind, honed by years of fixing broken machines, was now focused on the most complex, most perilous repair of all, mending a life entangled with the very forces that sought to destroy it. She was no longer just a widowed woman counting pennies. She was a guardian, a strategist, a survivor, actively engaging with a predatory system to ensure the survival of her child. The stakes were not just eviction but eradication, and Agnes, the widowed woman, was ready to fight. The fragile truce within the cabin was an intricate web of silent agreements and unspoken threats. Agnes, with her mechanic's precision, observed Kane's routines, the subtle rhythms of his guarded existence. He was a man of abrupt movements and economical words, his presence a constant low thrum of potential violence. Yet, she noticed the way his gaze sometimes lingered on Clara, a fleeting moment of something akin to paternal concern, quickly veiled by his hardened exterior. This observation, a micro-detection in her practiced emotional radar, was not a sign of softening, but a data point, a potential leverage, a weakness in the key, formidable architecture of his self-preservation. She began to catalogue these anomalies, these small deviations from the predatory archetype, understanding that within any complex system, the seemingly insignificant variables often held the most profound influence. Clara, meanwhile, found an unexpected, albeit terrifying, mentorship in Kane. He taught her rudimentary self-defense, movements sharp and brutal, devoid of grace but filled with efficiency. He showed her how to read a map with the meticulousness of an escape artist, how to detect a tail, how to blend into shadows. These were not lessons in childhood play, but protocols for survival, delivered with a detached severity that nonetheless imparted a chilling competence. Agnes watched these interactions, a knot of conflicting emotions tightening in her chest. Part of her recoiled at the brutal education her daughter was receiving, but another, more pragmatic part, acknowledged its necessity. Clara was learning to navigate a world that Agnes herself was only just beginning to comprehend, armed with tools she never imagined her daughter would need. The girl, in turn, adapted with a chilling alacrity, her initial fear slowly giving way to a nascent, practical understanding of danger. Her dreams of escape now layered with the grim realities of evasion. The cabin itself became a temporary laboratory for Agnes's analytical mind. She cleaned and organized with a methodical zeal, not out of domesticity, but out of a need to control the immediate environment, to reduce variables. She meticulously maintained the landau, each repair a silent communion with her mechanical heritage, ensuring their escape route remained viable. She taught Clara the basics of engine function, the language of fuel lines and spark plugs, a shared ritual that reasserted their bond amidst the escalating chaos. This transfer of knowledge was a deliberate act, equipping Clara with practical competence, a buffer against the pervasive helplessness that threatened to consume them. It was a silent testament to Agnes's philosophy. Knowledge was power, and practical skills were the bedrock of survival, especially when systems failed. The external threats, however, refused to remain external. Kane's burner phone, a constant source of terse commands and ominous reports, painted a grim picture of their diminishing window of safety. The Chasse Iron Hounds, relentless in their pursuit, were closing in, their methods crude but effective. Simultaneously, Detectives Harding and Rourke, their legal system moving with slow, inexorable force, were tightening their own net. Agnes understood the dual pressure, a vice slowly compressing their fragile sanctuary. She was caught between two competing systems, both relentless both impersonal, both seeking to impose their version of order. Kane, the Phantom, was the wild card, the unpredictable element that simultaneously threatened and protected them. One night, a distant drone of engines shattered the forest's quietude. Kane, his face a mask of grim resolve, barked orders. The Iron Hounds had found them. There was no time for deliberation, only action. Agnes, her heart hammering but her mind clear, directed Clara to a prearranged hiding spot beneath the cabin, a small dark crawl space she had meticulously cleared. She then grabbed her tool bag, a familiar weight in her hand, ready to engage the fight in her own way. Kane, a whirlwind of practiced violence, prepared for the ambush, his movements fluid and deadly. He was in his element, a predator cornered, ready to unleash fury. The confrontation was brutal and swift. The Iron Hounds. A wave of leather and roaring engines burst through the tree line, their crude aggression a stark contrast to Kane's calculated ferocity. Agnes, from the shadows, observed the engagement. She saw the patterns of their attack, the reliance on brute force, the lack of strategic finesse. She understood the inherent flaws in their system. She saw Kane move with a chilling efficiency, a dance of evasion and precise strikes, neutralizing threats with economical movements. Yet even Kane, formidable as he was, could not withstand an overwhelming force indefinitely. He was bleeding, his defenses beginning to fray. It was in that moment of escalating chaos that Agnes's unique competence asserted itself. While Kane engaged the primary threat, Agnes, moving with a silent, almost spectral grace, began her own campaign. She didn't wield a weapon, but she knew the architecture of the environment. A strategically placed oil slick on a blind curve of the dirt track, a hidden wire snagging a motorcycle tire, a loose board in the porch that sent an attacker sprawling. These were her interventions. Each small act was a disruption, a subtle sabotage of the Iron Hounds, and coordinated assault. She was not fighting them head-on. She was dismantling their system, exploiting its weaknesses. Her actions were born of a cold, analytical assessment of cause and effect, a precise application of her mechanical and observational skills to a kinetic, life-or-death situation. Her actions bought Kane crucial seconds, moments that allowed him to regroup, to redirect his counterattacks with renewed precision. The Iron Hounds, disoriented by the unexpected obstacles and the sudden loss of their initial momentum, found their aggression turning into confusion. Their system, built on predictable intimidation, was failing. The fight, initially a chaotic melee, began to shift, tipping precariously in Kane's favor. Agnes watched, a silent architect of their survival, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the intense focus of a problem solver engaged in a complex, high-stakes repair. She was not a warrior, but she was an engineer of chaos, subtly manipulating the variables of violence. The Iron Hounds, their numbers dwindling and their strategy compromised, eventually retreated, their roaring engines fading. Into the night, leaving behind a trail of damaged motorcycles and bewildered riders. Kane, breathing heavily, his face streaked with blood and grime, turned to Agnes, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It was not gratitude, not yet, but a dawning recognition of her unorthodox yet undeniably effective contribution. He saw beyond the widowed woman. He saw a formidable, unexpected ally. Agnes, in turn, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the momentary vulnerability that betrayed the immense cost of his violent existence. The lines of their reluctant alliance, forged in the crucible of shared peril, deepened. Clara emerged from her hiding spot, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She had heard the sounds of the struggle, the metallic clashes, the guttural shouts, but she had also witnessed her mother's quiet, methodical interventions. She saw Agnes, not as a helpless victim, but as a silent force, a guardian who fought with ingenuity rather than brute strength. This was a profound lesson, a redefinition of power and agency. The young girl who once dreamed of escaping now understood that survival was not just about running, but about strategic engagement, about understanding the hidden mechanics of conflict. The immediate danger had passed, but the cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battleground, its fragile peace irrevocably shattered. Agnes knew they could not stay. The chase, Iron Hounds, would return, stronger, more determined, their system, adapted to their previous failure. The police too would eventually trace the violence back to this isolated spot. The time for static defense was over. A new phase of their desperate flight was imminent. Agnes, her mind already shifting, began to plot their next move. The landau meticulously maintained awaited their command. The cold, clear night, illuminated by the distant stars, promised no respite, only the relentless continuation of their journey into the heart of an uncertain, perilous future. She was ready. Their survival depended on her ability to anticipate, to adapt, to repair not just machines, but the very fabric of their threatened existence. The decision to move was swift, devoid of sentimentality, a stark pivot from reaction to calculated preemption. Agnes, her mind now a vortex of tactical considerations, initiated the departure protocol she had subconsciously designed. The landau, once a symbol of past comforts, now morphed into an armored vessel of their future, however precarious. Clara, observing her mother's meticulous dismantling of their temporary haven, no longer saw merely a woman in distress, but a strategist, a master of contingency. The quiet efficiency with which Agnes packed their meager possessions, securing each item with a mechanical precision, was a silent lesson in resilience, a demonstration of how one mitigates loss by controlling the immediate variables. Clara's role shifted too, from passive observer to active participant, learning to distinguish essential from superfluous, to pack with speed and silence, her small hands mimicking Agnes's practiced movements. This joint endeavor, born of necessity, inadvertently fortified the architecture of their relational bond, transforming it into a functional partnership for survival. Kane, observing Agnes's methodical efficiency, offered no praise, only a terse nod of acknowledgement, his own preparations equally swift and brutal. He was patching his wounds, a stark tableau of raw flesh and grim determination, yet his eyes, those windows to a long-abandoned humanity, held a flicker of something new when he looked at Agnes. Not trust, perhaps, but a pragmatic recognition of shared competence. He issued new commands, a stream of coordinates and rendezvous points, a complex mental map for their evasion. Agnes processed them, each data point feeding into her internal navigational system, a complex algorithm of escape routes and contingency plans. She did not question his authority on the path ahead, recognizing that in this specific, dangerous domain, Kane was the undisputed expert, the flawed architect of their perilous journey. Her role was to execute, to adapt, to ensure the mechanics of their flight remained flawless. Their escape from the cabin was a masterclass in stealth. They moved under the deep, concealing cloak of the pre-dawn darkness, the landau's engine a hushed murmur against the vast, sleeping forest. Agnes drove with a heightened sense of awareness, her senses attuned to every shadow, every distant glint of light. She navigated the rough forest tracks with an intuitive understanding of the vehicle's limits, coaxing performance from its aged parts, a silent communion between woman and machine. Clara, in the passenger seat, scanned the rearview mirror, her young eyes already sharpened by the crucible of their flight, her posture tense with a vigilance that belied her years. She was learning to read the language of the road, the subtle indicators of pursuit, the rhythm of unseen dangers, the necessity of constant watchfulness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fear, a constant companion on their journey. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of driving, hiding, and moving again. Their existence became a fluid, nomadic dance on the periphery of society, a transient rhythm dictated by Kane's cryptic instructions and the relentless pursuit of their enemies. They avoided highways, preferring the forgotten back roads, the dusty trails, the places where the shadows lengthened and swallowed secrets whole. Agnes, at the wheel, became intimately familiar with the intricate network of forgotten America, its abandoned towns, its desolate landscapes, places that mirrored the internal desolation she carried. Each turn, each hidden stop, was a test of her endurance, a testament to her unyielding will. She learned to read the subtle changes in the weather, the patterns of animal migrations, the silent indicators of a land that held both harshness and unexpected refuge. Kane, though physically present, remained an enigma. His instructions were precise, his security protocols stringent, yet his interactions were minimal, almost transactional. He moved with a predatory grace, always alert, always assessing, a constant reminder of the danger that clung to them. Agnes continued her meticulous observations, seeking to understand the architecture of his being. She noticed the way he meticulously cleaned his weapons, a ritualistic act of preparation, the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the horizon with a profound, almost philosophical weariness. These subtle cues painted a picture not of a cartoon villain, but of a man profoundly shaped by his brutal environment, a product of the very systems he exploited, and in turn was pursued by. He was a machine, finely tuned for survival, and Agnes, the mechanic, sought to understand its complex engineering. The emotional toll, however, was immense. Clara, despite her burgeoning resilience, bore the weight of their precarious existence. Her dreams, once vibrant and hopeful, were now muted, shadowed by the constant threat of discovery. Agnes, ever vigilant, sought to nurture small moments of normalcy for her daughter. She would read aloud from a worn book during their rare moments of respite, her voice a soothing balm against the harsh realities of their flight. She found beauty in the desolate landscapes they traversed, pointing out a rare desert bloom or a soaring hawk, reminding Clara that even in desolation, life persisted, tenacious and defiant. These small, deliberate acts were not just diversions. They were acts of emotional maintenance, protocols for preserving the fragile integrity of Clara's spirit. Agnes understood that survival was not merely about physical evasion, but about sustaining the internal architecture of hope. One particularly tense night, deep in the desolate expanse of a forgotten national forest, Kane received an urgent coded message. The Iron Hounds, utilizing a network of informants and a brutal efficiency, had narrowed their search. They were closing in, faster than anticipated, their pursuit driven by a primal need for vengeance and the retrieval of the elusive ledger. Kane's face, usually a mask of controlled intensity, tightened further, a subtle ripple of alarm betraying his inner turmoil. He communicated their immediate peril with a series of terse, rapid-fire instructions outlining a new, more desperate escape route. Agnes listened, her heart quickening but her mind clear. The system was escalating, and their response had to be equally swift and precise. Their new destination was a remote, abandoned mining town, a ghost of forgotten prosperity, its decaying structures clinging precariously to the side of a canyon. It was a labyrinth of shadows and treacherous passages, a perfect stage for a final, desperate stand, Kane explained. His plan with brutal candor. He would use the town's complex layout to ambush the Iron Hounds, to shatter their pursuit once and for all. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy, a gamble that could either secure their freedom or lead to their ultimate demise. Agnes, though she understood the brutal logic, felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This was not merely about evasion. It was about direct, lethal confrontation. Clara, sensing the gravity of the situation, clung to Agnes, her small hand a desperate anchor. Agnes held her close, a silent promise of protection, her gaze scanning the desolate town, already dissecting its vulnerabilities, its hidden strengths. She noted the crumbling stone walls, the precarious wooden scaffolding, the deep, dark shafts of the abandoned mines, all potential weapons, all potential traps. Her mind, honed by years of mechanical intuition, began to process the environment, seeking to understand its intricate, dangerous architecture. She knew that in this final confrontation, mere survival would not be enough. They needed to dismantle the system of their pursuit, to break its relentless cycle. Kane, meanwhile, moved with a newfound intensity, a predatory focus. He was preparing the ground, setting traps, studying the terrain, a ghost orchestrating his own haunting. He positioned Agnes and Clara in a fortified, hidden observation post, a small, crumbling shack overlooking the main approach to the town. His instructions were stark. Remain hidden, remain silent, and under no circumstances intervene until explicitly commanded. Agnes, though she understood the need for discipline, felt a flicker of defiance. She was not a passive pawn in his game. She was an active participant, a silent strategist. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, began to meticulously map the town, observing Kane's movements, anticipating the Iron Hounds' likely approach, mentally charting alternative escape routes and intervention points. She was building her own internal operational map, a counter-strategy to his, a redundancy plan for their survival. The hours stretched, heavy with anticipation. The desert wind, a mournful lament, whispered through the decaying structures, carrying the scent of dust and fear. Clara, exhausted, eventually fell into a fitful sleep, her head resting on Agnes's lap. Agnes watched her daughter, a profound, unyielding love cementing her resolve. She was fighting not just for their lives, but for Clara's future, for the possibility of a world where dreams were not perpetually shadowed by the spectre of violence. She was fighting to repair the broken system of their existence, to recalibrate its trajectory towards safety and peace. Her competence, her analytical mind, her unyielding spirit, these were her weapons. The distant rumble of engines shattered the silence, growing steadily louder, more ominous. The Iron Hounds had arrived. Agnes felt a surge of adrenaline, her senses now hyper-alert. She saw the dust cloud rising in the distance, a harbinger of the approaching storm. Cain, a shadow amidst the shadows, took his final position. The stage was set for the climax, a brutal, desperate ballet of violence and survival. Agnes, gripping Clara's hand, watched, her mind already moving, calculating, preparing for her own intervention, for the moment when her unique competence would again be called upon to disrupt the predatory system that sought to consume them. She was no longer just a widowed woman. She was a guardian, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with, ready to rewrite the script of their fate. The silence before the storm in the forgotten mining town was not an absence of sound, but a compression of it. Every creak of decaying timber, every whisper of the desert wind through rusted metal, amplified by the terror building within Agnes. From her vantage point in the crumbling shack, she could discern the Iron Hounds' approach, not just by the growing rumble of their engines, but by the subtle shifts in the dust, the agitated flight of nocturnal birds. Their arrival was a wave of raw aggression, a brutal system of intimidation and force crashing against Cain's meticulously planned defense. Agnes, however, saw beyond the immediate spectacle of impending violence. She was observing the intricate mechanics of conflict, dissecting the Iron Hounds and formation, their evident lack of individual strategy, their reliance on collective unthinking momentum. This was a system built on dominance, not on adaptability, a fatal flaw she was primed to exploit. Clara stirred beside her, waking with a small gasp, her eyes snapping open to the harsh reality. Agnes's hand instinctively tightened around hers, a silent anchor in the burgeoning chaos. "Stay low, Clara, watch, learn." Her voice was a low murmur, steady, despite the frantic pulse in her veins. This wasn't just a command, it was a continuation of Clara's harsh, invaluable education in survival, a protocol for engagement with the stark realities of their world. Clara, though terrified, responded with an almost preternatural calm, her gaze fixed on the approaching figures, her own young mind absorbing the brutal ballet unfolding before her. She was not merely a victim, she was becoming an apprentice of vigilance, internalizing the micro-behaviors of conflict. The Iron Hounds stormed the periphery of the town, their motorcycles roaring like angry beasts, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. They moved with a reckless abandon, their confidence rooted in numerical superiority. But Cain, the Phantom, was not a man to be underestimated in his own chosen battlefield. He had transformed the decaying town into a death trap, each abandoned structure, each pile of rubble, a calculated component in his defensive architecture. He moved with a chilling grace, a blur of motion, as he engaged the first wave of attackers. Agnes watched, her mind a supercomputer processing every detail. The angles of attack, the lines of sight, the inevitable collateral damage. She saw Cain's brutal efficiency, the precision of his strikes, the way he neutralized threats with an almost surgical detachment. He was a force of nature, primal and unyielding, a broken system's most dangerous component. Yet even Cain had limits. The sheer volume of the Iron Hounds was relentless. They were not employing sophisticated tactics, but they were a tide, slowly eroding his defenses. Agnes saw him take a hit, a glancing blow that staggered him, the momentary flash of pain in his eyes quickly masked by renewed ferocity. This was her cue. Her role was not to fight head-on, a battle she could not win, but to disrupt the enemy's system, to inject variables of chaos into their predictable aggression. Her knowledge of mechanics, her acute understanding of cause and effect, became her arsenal. While Cain diverted the main assault, Agnes initiated her own, silent counter-offensive. They knew the town's layout, its hidden passages and precarious structural weaknesses. She had spent hours in the shack, not just observing but mentally mapping, anticipating. Her first target was the narrow, winding path leading to the higher levels of the mining operation, a natural choke point for the attacking motorcycles. Using a pre-positioned length of frayed rope and a heavy, rusted gear from an abandoned hoist, she created a tripwire, strategically placed to snag the front wheel of the lead bike. The ensuing crash was a symphony of screeching metal and guttural curses, a domino effect that sent several more riders sprawling. This wasn't an act of brute force, but of intelligent sabotage, a disruption of their forward momentum, a critical system failure. Next, she focused on visibility. The Iron Hounds relied on clear lines of sight, on their collective visual dominance. Agnes, recalling her father's lessons on light and shadow, targeted the few remaining sources of illumination. Around the town, old sputtering gas lamps that cast long, deceptive shadows. With a well-aimed rock, she shattered one, plunging a key access point into deeper darkness. She repeated the action, creating pockets of obscurity, disorienting the attackers, forcing them to hesitate, to question what lay beyond the diminishing light. This was emotional warfare, leveraging their reliance on predictability against them. She wasn't just hiding. She was actively reshaping their sensory environment, making their known world unknown. Her most audacious intervention involved the very architecture of the canyon. Above the main cluster of buildings where the fiercest fighting raged, stood a precarious, half-collapsed wooden water tower, its base weakened by decades of neglect and desert erosion. Agnes, with a grim determination, knew it was a calculated risk. While Cain was locked in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle, Agnes, moving with an agility that belied her years, scaled a nearby, less stable structure, a crumbling processing plant. From there, she could access the precarious footing leading to the tower. Her movements were precise, methodical, each step tested, each handhold secured. She was no longer just the widow. She was an engineer on a mission, her focus absolute. Reaching the tower's base, she located a critical support beam, visibly rotted and compromised. She didn't have tools for demolition, but she had the leverage of her body and the strength of her desperation. With a series of powerful rhythmic kicks, she exploited the beam's inherent weakness, pushing against the decayed wood, forcing the structural integrity to yield. The groan of ancient timber, a sound of profound distress, momentarily drowned out the sounds of the battle below. Then, with a shattering crack, the beam gave way. The water tower, with a deafening splintering of wood and a cascade of rusted metal, collapsed with a thunderous roar, showering a section of the town with debris and a cloud of choking dust. It wasn't directly aimed at the Iron Hounds, but its effect was far more devastating. It created a massive, impassable barrier, splitting their forces, isolating key members, and throwing their entire attack formation into disarray. The psychological impact was immediate. The Iron Hounds, already disoriented by the subtle sabotages, were now faced with a catastrophic environmental shift. Their system, built on numbers and brute force, was incapable of adapting to such a profound, unexpected disruption. Confusion morphed into panic. Their roars turned to cries of alarm. Their coordinated assault fractured into isolated pockets of individual terror. This wasn't a fight against Cain. It was a battle against the very landscape, now weaponized by Agnes's ingenuity. Cain, seizing the moment of their disarray, moved with renewed ferocity, his attacks now surgical, aimed at the exposed, vulnerable leaders. He was no longer fighting a tide. He was executing a precise strike against a broken system. Agnes watched him, a new understanding dawning. He was a master of chaos, yes, but he was also a creature of opportunity, adapting his brutal strategies to the conditions she had created. Their actions, though separate, were now inextricably linked, two disparate systems working in perverse, horrifying synchronicity. Clara, from her hidden perch, witnessed it all. She saw the fear in the eyes of the attackers, the chaos of their retreat. But more. Profoundly, she saw her mother, not with a weapon in her hand, but with a mind that turned the world itself into a strategic advantage. This was a different kind of strength, a resilience forged not in physical might, but in an unwavering analytical focus, a profound understanding of how things worked, even in the heart of destruction. Clara's own fear was slowly replaced by a sense of awe and a nascent, fierce pride. Her mother was not just surviving, she was orchestrating survival, dismantling the very architecture of their torment. The last of the Iron Hounds, their spirit broken, their numbers decimated, finally fled, their motorcycles disappearing into the vast, indifferent desert night. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the echoes of violence, but it was a silence of victory. Cain, his body a canvas of fresh bruises and cuts, stood amidst the debris, surveying the aftermath with a grim satisfaction. He looked up at Agnes, who was now slowly descending from her precarious perch, a long searching gaze passing between them. No words were needed. In the crucible of that battle, their alliance had solidified, not out of affection, but out of a shared, brutal understanding of competence and survival. Agnes had proven herself not just a mechanic of engines, but an engineer of fate, capable of disrupting the most violent of systems with her unique, understated brilliance. Agnes reached Clara, pulling her close, the scent of dust and fear clinging to them. Both. Clara buried her face in her mother's shoulder, a shudder running through her small frame, but it was a shudder of release, not of renewed terror. She had seen the monster, and she had seen her mother face it down, not with a roar, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a woman who understood the language of broken things. The mining town, once a symbol of forgotten hopes, was now a testament to their harrowing, shared victory. But it was also a stark reminder that their journey was far from over. This was merely one battle won, one system temporarily disabled. The larger architecture of their pursuit remained, ever present, ever threatening. The decision to move, to keep moving, was not just tactical, it was now a fundamental principle of their existence. Agnes, the widow of Steele, had not only repaired a motor, but had, in the process, rebuilt the very framework of their desperate survival, ready for whatever unforgiving road lay ahead. The night air was cold, but within Agnes a fire had been kindled, a fierce protective flame that would not be extinguished. The immediate aftermath of the battle in the mining town was a landscape scarred by violence, yet imbued with a profound, unsettling stillness. The air, heavy with the metallic tang of fear and the acrid scent of gunpowder, began to clear, revealing the debris of shattered motorcycles and scattered equipment. Cain, a formidable silhouette against the rising dust, stood amidst the wreckage, his body a map of fresh wounds, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed a grim satisfaction. He surveyed the destruction he had wrought, a predator who had successfully defended his territory. Agnes, descending from her precarious perch, pulled Clara even tighter, her own body humming with the residual adrenaline of her calculated interventions. The terror of the confrontation still lingered, a phantom limb of fear, but it was now tempered by a raw, unyielding sense of agency. She had not merely survived. She had actively engineered their survival, disrupting the enemy's system with a brilliance that was both unexpected and devastating. Clara, her face still buried in Agnes's shoulder, trembled not just from fear, but from the immense emotional processing of what she had witnessed. Her mother, the quiet, resourceful woman she knew, had transformed into a silent force of nature, a guardian who weaponized her environment with an almost terrifying ingenuity. This new image of Agnes, forged in the crucible of battle, began to overwrite the girl's fading childhood innocence, replacing it with a hard-won understanding of resilience and a profound, nascent respect for a strength far more complex than brute force. Agnes, recognizing the subtle shifts in her daughter's breathing, the way Clara's small hand now held hers with a possessive strength, understood that this ordeal was not just about physical escape, but about the profound, irreversible resculpting of their internal landscapes. The architecture of their relationship had deepened, evolving from dependent care to a partnership forged in shared peril and mutual unspoken competence. Cain, without a word, began to move, his movement stiff but purposeful. He methodically checked the bodies of the downed Iron Hounds, retrieving weapons, extracting anything of value. It was a cold, pragmatic act, devoid of remorse, a protocol of war. Agnes watched him, her analytical mind dissecting his actions, understanding that this ruthlessness was not gratuitous, but a necessary component of his survival system. He was stripping the vanquished of their resources, reducing their ability to retaliate, dismantling their network from the ground up. He was not just fighting, he was cleansing, ensuring no loose ends remained from this particular confrontation. Yet, even in this brutal efficiency, Agnes saw the underlying exhaustion, the immense cost of maintaining such a predatory existence. He was a finely tuned machine of destruction. But even machines had limits. Even the phantom could bleed. The silence was broken only by the distant howl of a coyote, a lonely lament under the cold, indifferent stars. Kane finally turned to them, his gaze sweeping over Agnes and Clara, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "We move. Now." His voice was rough, but held an undeniable urgency. The mining town, now a graveyard for his former enemies, was compromised. The dust of their battle would soon attract others, the remaining Ironhounds, vengeful and desperate, or perhaps even the authorities, their slow, inexorable gears of justice finally grinding towards this remote location. Agnes nodded, already mentally charting their escape. The Landau, their battered but reliable sanctuary, awaited. Their departure from the mining town was swift and silent, leaving behind the echoes of violence and the grim testament to Agnes's unexpected brilliance. As they drove away, the faint glow of the pre-dawn sky painted the canyon walls in hues of purple and grey, a stark contrast to the darkness they were leaving behind. Clara, curled in the back seat, eventually drifted into an exhausted sleep, her body still trembling occasionally. Agnes, at the wheel, felt the familiar vibrations of the Landau's engine, a steady rhythm that anchored her amidst the storm of her thoughts. She knew this victory was temporary, a respite bought at a terrible price. The core problem, Kane's digital ledger and the intricate scheme of pension fund diversion, remained. The confrontation with Brock, the original architect of the illicit empire, was still an unresolved, looming threat. Kane, in the passenger seat, was uncharacteristically quiet. He was tapping at his burner phone, his thumbs moving with a practiced speed, sending terse, coded messages. Agnes, acutely aware of his every micro-expression, sensed a shift in his demeanor. The controlled intensity that usually defined him was now tinged with a deeper current of apprehension. This was not the fear of a hunted animal, but the strategic anxiety of a chess master anticipating a dangerous counter-move. Her observational skills, honed by years of deciphering the subtle tells of human distress, registered this internal shift with alarming clarity. She knew he was calculating, anticipating, and the weight of his contemplation filled the small space of the Landau with a palpable tension. Days later, they found themselves in a new, equally desolate refuge, a decaying, forgotten motel on the edge of a vast salt-flaked plain. Its faded neon sign, flickering weakly, was a mockery of welcome. Here, in the sterile anonymity of a dusty room, the true purpose of their flight, and the ultimate gamble for their freedom, began to crystallize. Kane finally broke his silence, his voice low and gravelly, laced with an unfamiliar note of grim finality. "Brock knows." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Agnes understood. Brock, Kane's former leader, the patriarch of the illicit empire, was not only aware of Kane's betrayal, but was now actively seeking retribution. The stakes had been raised, the final act drawing near. Kane then laid out his plan, his words clipped, precise, each sentence a hammer blow of cold logic. He was going to meet Brock, not to surrender but to orchestrate a final, decisive exchange. The digital ledger, the very map to his illicit empire, would be offered as the ultimate bargaining chip. But it was a trap. Kane knew Brock, knew his ruthless ambition, his ingrained treachery. Brock would never allow Kane or anyone associated with him to walk away freely. This wasn't an exchange, it was a detonation, designed to destroy the entire system, himself included if necessary, to ensure the safety of Agnes and Clara. "The ledger," Kane explained, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen horizon. "It's encrypted. I have the key. Without it, it's just noise. But Brock needs it to secure his control, to legitimize his new regime. He thinks he can force me to give it up. He paused, a muscle in his jaw twitching. He's wrong. It's rigged. A dead man's switch. If I don't input the key at a specific time, in a specific place, it wipes itself, takes everything with it. His whole empire. Gone. Agnes listened, her mind reeling, processing the brutal elegance of his design. It was a system of absolute control, a weapon of last resort. Kane wasn't just offering a ledger, he was offering a nuclear option, a final cataclysmic act of destruction that would erase his past and potentially guarantee their future. But the implication was clear. Kane intended to walk into a situation where he might not walk out. He was preparing to sacrifice himself, to become the ultimate loose end, severed cleanly from their existence, ensuring his enemies would have no further reason to pursue them. The Phantom was preparing his final disappearance. Clara, who had been feigning sleep, now stirred. Her eyes wide and filled with a fragile comprehension. She had heard enough, sensed enough. The gravity of Kane's words, the finality in his tone, settled heavily in the small room. She looked at her mother, then at Kane, her small hand reaching out instinctively, grasping Agnes's arm. Agnes returned the squeeze, a silent promise to her daughter that she would navigate this too. Kane looked at Agnes then, a long, appraising gaze that held no sentimentality, only a cold, hard assessment. Your skills. You understood the hounds. You understood their weaknesses. Brock is different. He's smarter, more patient, but he's still a system, with flaws. He pushed a small, battered notebook across the table towards her, along with another burner phone. This is a secondary key, a failsafe. If something goes wrong, if I don't make it out, you use this. At precisely 0300 hours. Not a second before, not a second after. It's a timer. If it runs out, the ledger wipes anyway. But this gives you a window. It buys you time to disappear, and it detonates his whole operation no matter what. Agnes picked up the notebook. It was filled with cryptic symbols, dates, times, and a series of seemingly random numbers. It was the language of his network, the true architecture of his illicit world. She recognized it as a mechanic would recognize a wiring diagram, complex but decipherable with the right protocol. This was not merely a key, it was a manual, a blueprint of his destruction and their potential freedom. The weight of it in her hand was immense, a tangible burden of life and death. The location for the meet, Kane revealed, was the abandoned grain silo where the narrative had begun. Not the initial, dilapidated one, but its twin, miles away, a desolate monument to forgotten agriculture. It was a place of echoes and shadows, a fitting stage for the final act of his brutal drama. Brock will bring his full force, Kane stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He'll want to make an example. He'll want to retrieve the ledger, and he'll want me dead. Agnes's analytical mind was already working, dissecting the new information. The silo, a massive, echoing structure of dust and regret, presented both immense danger and unique opportunities. She recalled her father's lessons on structural weaknesses, on acoustics, on leverage. If Kane was preparing a final act of demolition, she needed to understand the mechanics of that explosion, to anticipate its ripple effects, to ensure Clara's safety amidst the inevitable fallout. This wasn't just about the ledger, it was about the detonation of an entire criminal architecture, and they would be in the blast radius. The moral conflict, a constant undercurrent in her journey, now reached its painful crescendo. She was being asked to facilitate the destruction of an empire built on the ruin of others, to become an accomplice in a violent final act. Yet the alternative was unthinkable, the relentless pursuit, the constant danger to Clara. Her choice was no longer between good and evil, but between two forms of destruction, one controlled and decisive, the other chaotic and unending. She had to choose the system that offered the highest probability of Clara's survival, even if it meant aligning herself with a man who embodied everything she detested. Agnes looked at Kane, seeing him not as a simple villain, but as a complex, broken system, a man shaped by the brutal logic of his world. He was offering them a path, a perilous, blood-soaked path, to an improbable freedom. Her gaze then drifted to Clara, sleeping fitfully on the worn motel bed, her young face etched with the anxieties of their flight, the profound love for her daughter, The fierce, protective flame that had been kindled in her soul extinguished all other considerations. Her gaze then drifted to Clara, sleeping fitfully on the worn motel bed, her young face etched with the anxieties of their flight. The profound love for her daughter, the fierce protective flame that had been kindled in her soul, extinguished all other considerations. It was a choice born not of malice, but of the primal, unyielding imperative to protect her child. She would navigate this final, brutal act not as an accomplice, but as a guardian, an engineer of their desperate salvation. Agnes picked up the burner phone and the notebook, their cold weight in her hands a tangible commitment to the perilous task ahead. "Tell me everything," she commanded, her voice low, steady, a steel beneath the surface. Every detail, every variable. The hours that followed in the sterile motel room became a crucible of planning, a meticulous dissection of Kane's audacious strategy. Agnes, in her meticulous way, pressed Kane for every conceivable detail. She did not merely listen, she interrogated, challenged, and cross-referenced. Her questions were not emotional pleas, but incisive probes into the mechanics of his design, seeking its weaknesses, its redundancies, its potential points of failure. "How will Brock approach the silo?" she asked, her eyes scanning a crude drawing Kane had sketched of the structure. "What are his typical tactical patterns? Does he favor frontal assault, or does he flank? What is the expected number of his men?" Kane, initially terse, found himself responding to her almost clinical curiosity, revealing layers of his criminal world that he usually kept guarded. He described Brock's methodical ruthlessness, his preference for overwhelming force, but also his predictable reliance on established protocols, a vulnerability Agnes immediately recognized. She absorbed his responses, transforming abstract threats into concrete variables, charting mental flowcharts of probable outcomes. She was mapping the architecture of the impending conflict, identifying the critical points where her unique interventions could once again tip the scales. Clara, now fully awake, sat quietly on the bed, observing the intense exchange. She no longer understood the specific technical jargon, but she understood the gravity. She watched her mother, a woman transformed from quiet widow to calculating strategist, engaged in a high-stakes intellectual battle with the enigmatic Phantom. The shift in Agnes's demeanor, the laser-like focus in her eyes, the way she compelled Kane to reveal his hidden world, this was a profound lesson in agency. Clara saw that competence wasn't just about physical strength, it was about the power of analysis, the precision of thought, the courage to engage with complex, dangerous systems. She began to ask her own questions, small, tentative probes into the practicalities of their escape. "Where will we meet you after? How will we know if it worked?" Agnes answered her patiently, integrating her daughter's anxieties into the larger operational plan, teaching her, implicitly, the importance of contingency. Agnes focused on the silo itself, a structure that, in its decay, offered both sanctuary and treacherous risk. She extracted details about its internal layout, its ventilation systems, its access points, its structural integrity. Kane described the narrow walkways, the echoing interior, the treacherous grain chutes. Agnes envisioned it all, mentally transforming the silo from a mere location into a complex, multi-layered machine, each component a potential element in her defensive architecture. She began to formulate micro-interventions, silent acts of sabotage similar to those she'd employed in the mining town. A loose ladder, a jammed chute, a compromised support beam. These were not weapons, but variables to be manipulated, disruptions to be injected into the enemy's predictable system. She needed to create chaos, not for its own sake, but to create a specific narrow window for Kane's plan to unfold, and for their own escape. Their preparations involved more than just tactical discussions. Agnes meticulously prepared the Landau, her trusted companion. Every fluid level checked, every tire pressure adjusted, every spark plug cleaned. The engine, a familiar symphony of precise components, responded to her touch. She wasn't just fixing a car. She was fortifying their primary escape mechanism, ensuring its optimal performance under extreme pressure. This ritual of maintenance was also a form of meditation, a way to anchor herself in the predictable logic of mechanics amidst the terrifying unpredictability of their situation. Clara assisted her, handing tools, learning the names of components, understanding the importance of meticulous preparation. It was a shared ritual, a silent affirmation of their bond and their commitment to survival. Cain, meanwhile, prepared in his own brutal fashion. He cleaned and loaded his weapons, his movements precise, almost meditative. He studied maps, identified patrol routes, and planned his entry and exit strategies. He explained to Agnes the intricacies of his dead man's switch, how the secondary key he gave her would need to be activated at a precise moment regardless of his status. "If you don't hear from me by Aero 250, consider me gone," he stated, his voice flat. "Activate the key at Aero 300 sharp, not before, not after. It's the window. It'll give you enough time to get clear before Brock realizes what's happening." Agnes committed the times to memory, the numbers burning into her consciousness. This was not just a timer, it was a countdown to a potential cataclysm, a moment when she would become the ultimate arbiter of Brock's fate and their own. The moral weight of this responsibility pressed on Agnes. She was being asked to decide the fate of a criminal empire, to become an executioner of a system, even if it was a system built on ruin. The logic was clear. To allow Brock's empire to persist was to guarantee their perpetual pursuit. To dismantle it was to create a vacuum, a momentary reprieve, a chance at true disappearance. It was a brutal equation, and Agnes, in her profound, unyielding love for Clara, chose the path that maximized her daughter's chances of survival. It wasn't justice she sought, but peace, however bloody its procurement. She would become a reluctant participant in this final act of destruction, not out of vengeance, but out of a fierce, protective pragmatism. The night of the confrontation arrived with a cold, unforgiving moon, casting long, stark shadows across the salt flats. The abandoned grain silo loomed on the horizon, a monolithic sentinel of decay, its metallic surfaces gleaming eerily under the moonlight. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the hum of the Landau's engine and the frantic beating of Agnes's heart. They approached the silo complex under the cover of darkness, parking the Landau in a predetermined, concealed location, a small rocky outcrop partially obscured by ancient mesquite trees. Agnes cut the engine, plunging them into a sudden, unsettling quiet. Cain turned to Agnes, his face a mask of grim. "A resolve." "This is it," he said, his voice a low rasp. There was no farewell, no sentimentality, only the stark reality of their parting. He looked at Clara, a fleeting, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the young girl's courage. Then he was gone, a phantom disappearing into the labyrinthine shadows of the silo, a ghost walking willingly into the heart of his own destruction. Agnes watched him go, a knot of conflicting emotions tightening in her chest. He was a monster, yes, a predator, but in this moment he was also their unlikely protector, a man willing to sacrifice himself for the improbable freedom of a widowed mechanic and her daughter. Agnes and Clara remained in the Landau, hidden, waiting. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed a stark red, ticking down the seconds towards 0300. Agnes held the burner phone and the notebook, their weight a heavy reminder of her crucial, terrifying task. Her senses were hyper-alert, straining to detect any sound, any movement from the distant silo. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each second amplifying the tension, the suffocating awareness of their precarious existence. Clara, her hand nestled firmly in Agnes's, whimpered softly, a small, fragile sound that pierced the silence. Agnes squeezed her hand reassuringly, a silent promise that she would not fail. Suddenly, a distant roar of engines shattered the silence, growing rapidly louder. Brock and his forces had arrived. Agnes peered through the Landau's windshield, catching glimpses of dozens of headlights carving through the darkness, illuminating the approaching storm. The noise grew deafening, a cacophony of roaring motorcycles and harsh, guttural shouts. The silo, once silent, now vibrated with the raw, untamed energy of a full-scale assault. Agnes could not see the fighting, but she could hear it. The sharp cracks of gunfire, the metallic clang of impact, the screams of men. The air thrummed with violence, a visceral echo of the brutal confrontation unfolding within the ancient structure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind remained clear, focused on the glowing digits of the clock, the precise timing of her intervention. She was an engineer of fate, and the precise activation of Kane's dead man's switch was the final, critical component in his elaborate, self-destructive design. The ultimate repair, or the ultimate collapse of their intertwined existence, lay in her steady hands. The weight of the moment was immense, crushing. Yet Agnes, the widowed woman of steel, would not falter. What's one unexpected skill you developed or discovered about yourself when faced with a difficult challenge, just like Agnes found new strength in her mechanical expertise? Share your story in the comments. The digital clock on the Landau's dashboard became the focal point of Agnes's universe. Its stark red digits, a countdown to either salvation or ultimate despair. The cacophony emanating from the silo, the explosive crack of gunfire, the guttural shouts, the metallic clang of bodies in brutal contact, was a visceral soundtrack to the high-stakes gamble unfolding. Each distant sound was a raw data point processed by Agnes with an almost clinical detachment, yet simultaneously reverberating through her very core. She visualized the interior of the silo, its echoing emptiness, now a theater of carnage, each detail Kane had described becoming terrifyingly real in her mind's eye. She imagined Kane, the phantom, moving through the shadows, a singular force of destruction against the relentless tide of Brock's men, meticulously dismantling the system that had created him and that now sought to consume him. Clara, nestled beside her, had ceased whimpering, replaced by a tense, shallow breathing that mirrored Agnes's own. The girl's small hand, still intertwined with her mother's, was an anchor, a constant reminder of the profound, unyielding purpose driving Agnes. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, not in fear, but to sharpen her internal focus, to quiet the external chaos, and concentrate on the precise timing. Her father's lessons, not just of mechanical precision, but of unwavering resolve in the face of daunting odds, echoed in her memory. He had taught her that in moments of extreme pressure, the machine, whether engine or human, demanded absolute clarity, an unflinching adherence to protocol. This was her protocol. The clock ticked past Aero 250. No word from Kane. A cold dread, sharp and precise as a surgical blade, sliced through Agnes. His silence was the verdict. He was gone. The phantom had made his final, most complete disappearance. The weight of that realization was immense, a crushing burden of grief for a man she barely knew, a monster who had in his own brutal way become their protector. But there was no time for mourning. His sacrifice now rested entirely in her hands. The secondary key, the dead man's switch, was her responsibility, her gaze fixed on the glowing digits. 0259, 0259, 03. With a deliberate, unhesitating motion, Agnes retrieved the burner phone and the battered notebook. Her fingers, steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, moved with a practiced fluidity, punching in the cryptic sequence from the notebook, a code that was both an act of digital assassination and a desperate plea for their freedom. Each press of a button was a conscious choice, a commitment to the violent unraveling of an empire, an act of calculated destruction for the sake of survival. She was not just entering data, she was detonating a system, setting off a chain reaction that would reshape their perilous world. The moment she pressed the final digit, the world outside the Landau erupted. It wasn't a single explosion, but a rapid, cascading series of detonations, a symphony of destruction that tore through the night. A blinding flash of light, white-hot and incandescent, emanated from the silo, momentarily turning the pre-dawn darkness into a searing artificial day. Then came the sound, a thunderous ear-splitting roar that shook the very ground beneath the Landau, rattling its old chassis, vibrating through Agnes's bones. Chunks of concrete, twisted metal, and splintered wood rained down around them, not directly impacting their concealed spot, but close enough to be a terrifying, visceral reminder of the immense forces unleashed. The silo, that monolithic sentinel of decay, was no more. In its place was a burgeoning inferno, a colossal pyre consuming what remained of the structure, and by extension Brock's illicit empire. The sky above was suddenly illuminated by angry orange flames, licking at the darkness, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the distant canyon walls. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning fuel, pulverized concrete, and something else, something organic, chillingly reminiscent of burning flesh. Agnes, her grip still firm on Clara's hand, felt a profound, almost spiritual tremor run through her. She had done it. She had pulled the trigger, detonating not just a physical structure, but the entire intricate architecture of a criminal enterprise. The system was dead, obliterated in a single cataclysmic act. The relentless pursuit, the constant danger to Clara, the pervasive shadow of Kane's world, all of it had been consumed in that fiery eruption. Clara, gasping, shielded her eyes with her free hand, her small body pressed against Agnes. But when she finally lowered her arm, her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and awe, reflected the horrifying beauty of the inferno. She looked at her mother, a silent question in her gaze. Agnes met her eyes, a grim, unwavering resolve etched onto her features. There were no easy answers, no comforting platitudes, only the stark, brutal truth of what had been done and why. Agnes knew with an absolute certainty that Brock and his men, caught in the heart of that engineered cataclysm, would have been utterly annihilated. Kane, too, the phantom who orchestrated his own disappearance, would have vanished completely, becoming an indelible part of the destructive legacy he left behind. His sacrifice, grotesque as it was, had achieved its purpose. He had been the ultimate loose end, severed and destroyed, ensuring that no trace of him and no reason for further pursuit remained. The aftermath was a panorama of chaos and emerging silence. The roaring flames began to diminish, slowly giving way to a more subdued, crackling inferno. The tremors subsided, replaced by a lingering vibration in the air. The silence that followed was not empty, but heavy with the weight of consequence, a profound stillness that spoke of total eradication. The criminal system, vast and insidious, that had haunted their every step, was now nothing but ash and smoke, a terrible monument to its own undoing. Agnes started the Landau's engine. It rumbled to life, a familiar, comforting sound amidst the desolation. She put the car in drive, slowly navigating away from the burning ruin, leaving behind the epicenter of destruction. They drove in silence, the glow of the distant inferno gradually fading in the rearview mirror as they ventured deeper into the pre-dawn darkness. The road ahead was uncertain, unmarked, but it was, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, their own. As the sun began to paint the eastern horizon with muted hues of rose and gold, Agnes felt the residual tension slowly drain from her body, replaced by a profound, almost bone-deep exhaustion. But beneath the weariness, a new sensation stirred, a fragile, nascent sense of liberation. They were free, free from the eviction notice, free from the threat of the iron hounds, free from the ominous shadow of Kane's illicit world. The money Kane had given her, tainted as it was, now held a new meaning. It was not just a temporary reprieve. It was the seed of a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to create a future, unmarred by the ghosts of the past. She looked at Clara, who had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, her face no longer etched with fear, but softened by the exhaustion of their shared ordeal. A fierce, protective love surged through Agnes, a love so potent it could reshape mountains. She had navigated the treacherous currents of this violent world, not with weapons, but with her wits, her unwavering resolve, and her unique understanding of systems, how to repair them, how to dismantle them, how to make them yield to her will. She was no longer just a widowed woman, counting pennies and mourning a lost past. She was a survivor, a strategist, an engineer of fate. The road stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt winding through the vast, indifferent desert. But now it was a road of possibility, not just escape. Agnes understood that their journey was not simply about physical movement, but about an ongoing process of rebuilding, of healing, of establishing new protocols for their existence. The wounds, both seen and unseen, would linger. The memories of violence, of fear, of loss would remain. But they would also carry the indelible mark of their resilience, of Agnes's fierce competence, of Clara's newfound strength. Their lives would be defined not by the destruction they had witnessed, but by the quiet, methodical acts of creation that would follow. Agnes would continue to repair, to build, to nurture. She would teach Clara not just to survive, but to thrive, to understand the intricate mechanics of the world, and to wield that knowledge with wisdom and compassion. The desert wind, once a mournful lament, now felt like a cleansing breath, carrying away the remnants of their old lives, ushering in the promise of a new dawn. Agnes, the widowed woman of steel, gripped the steering wheel, her gaze fixed on the horizon, ready to drive them towards a future they had fought, bled, and engineered into existence. The architecture of their new life, though still unformed, was waiting to be built, brick by emotional brick, under the vast silent expanse of an open sky. The desert unfurled before them, a canvas of endless possibilities and unforgiving realities. Agnes, her hands steady on the Landau's wheel, felt the vast emptiness not as a void, but as an invitation. The fire behind them, though fading, had cauterized their past, severing the last threads that bound them to a world of violence and fear. Clara, stirring from her deep slumber, stretched, her eyes blinking open to the muted dawn. She looked at Agnes, a new kind of awareness in her gaze, a silent question that transcended words. Agnes returned her look, a faint, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips, a shared understanding of the unspeakable journey they had just endured. This was not the end of their story, but the quiet, deliberate beginning of its next chapter. The architecture of their new freedom was not a destination, but a continuous process of construction, built on the bedrock of Agnes's competence and Clara's burgeoning resilience. The first few weeks were a methodical exercise in re-establishing control, a deliberate application of Agnes's observational and analytical skills to their new, unmoored existence. The tainted money from Kane, a grim legacy of his destructive empire, was treated with the same pragmatic detachment she applied to a broken engine. It was a resource, a tool to be utilized with utmost efficiency and foresight, not a symbol to be morally debated. She established a strict budget, meticulously tracking every penny, every expenditure, understanding that financial stability was the new frontier of their survival. Each purchase, groceries, fuel, a modest room in a transient motel far from any known routes, was a micro-decision, a strategic allocation of limited resources aimed at maximizing their long-term viability. This was her new protocol, a daily ritual of economic vigilance. They moved with a fluid, almost spectral efficiency, mimicking Kane's earlier evasive tactics, but imbued with Agnes's own distinct purpose. Their route was a deliberate zigzag across state lines, a series of calculated movements designed to obscure any trail, to dissolve their presence in the vast anonymity of America's backroads. Agnes preferred the smaller towns, the ones forgotten by time, where a lone woman and her daughter in an old landau blended seamlessly into the backdrop of transience. In these places, she didn't seek connection but quiet observation. She studied the local mechanics, the rhythms of their small economies, the subtle tells of their social systems, always preparing for the next move, always anticipating potential vulnerabilities. Her intuition, sharpened by years of quiet observation, became her compass. Clara, though still processing the trauma of their flight, adapted with a remarkable, almost chilling alacrity. She had seen her mother not just survive, but orchestrate survival, and this example had imprinted upon her a new understanding of personal agency. She participated in their new routines with a quiet determination, learning to read maps, to identify different types of vehicles, to scan horizons for unfamiliar shadows. Agnes taught her basic car maintenance, turning simple tasks like checking tire pressure or oil levels into shared rituals, physical manifestations of their reliance on each other and their shared commitment to maintaining their fragile infrastructure of freedom. These practical skills were not merely tasks. They were protocols for self-reliance, building blocks for Clara's own competence. Agnes, however, understood that physical escape was only one dimension of their healing. The emotional architecture, fractured by trauma and loss, needed its own meticulous repair. She created small, consistent rituals of emotional connection for Clara. Evenings were for reading aloud from worn paperbacks salvaged from roadside bins. Her voice a soothing balm against the lingering anxieties. She encouraged Clara to articulate her fears, to process the violence she had witnessed, not by dwelling on the horrors, but by framing them as challenges overcome, as lessons learned. This was a deliberate act of relational maintenance, a conscious effort to rebuild the internal trust and security that had been so profoundly shaken. Agnes understood that unprocessed trauma was a system malfunction, and it required careful, consistent intervention. One sweltering afternoon, the Landau sputtered and died on a deserted stretch of road, a familiar, unwelcome echo of their past. This time, however, there was no panic, no frantic despair. Agnes, with a quiet competence, identified the problem: a faulty fuel pump, a systemic failure she understood intimately. Clara, without being asked, began to gather the necessary tools from the trunk, her movements precise, her face devoid of fear. Together, mother and daughter, they dismantled the old pump, cleaned the lines, and installed a spare Agnes had meticulously acquired and stored. It was a physical manifestation of their new reality: self-reliance, shared competence, and an unwavering commitment to repairing what was broken. The old Landau, once a symbol of their fragility, now pulsed with a renewed strength, a testament to their combined ingenuity. As days bled into weeks, Agnes began to recognize a deeper, more profound shift within herself. The initial grief for Thomas, once a consuming spiral of degradation, now held a new complex layer of understanding. His death had left her vulnerable, exposed, but it was in that very vulnerability that she had discovered a fierce, unyielding competence she never knew she possessed. She had faced true predators, navigated lethal systems, and emerged not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. Her mechanical expertise, once a quiet hobby, had become the very language of her survival, a metaphor for her ability to dissect, understand and repair the fractured systems of her life. She was no longer just Agnes Miller, the widow. She was Agnes Miller, the architect of her own redemption, a woman who understood the profound power of applied knowledge. The future remained an unwritten script, a vast open road stretching into an unknown horizon. But for the first time in a long time, Agnes faced it not with trepidation, but with a quiet, resolute anticipation. The money, though finite, provided a temporary buffer, a strategic resource for a measured re-entry into a life unmarred by flight. She envisioned a small, independent garage, a place where her mechanical expertise could be applied not just to engines, but to the broken dreams of others, a sanctuary of repair and practical wisdom. She would continue to teach Clara not just the mechanics of cars, but the mechanics of life, the importance of observation, the power of critical thinking, the resilience of the human spirit. Their journey was no longer a frantic escape, but a deliberate exploration of their newfound freedom. Each sunrise brought not a renewed sense of dread, but a quiet, almost philosophical curiosity about what the day would reveal. The desert, once a symbol of their desolate past, now felt like a vast, silent witness to their ongoing transformation, its harsh beauty mirroring the raw, unyielding strength that had blossomed within Agnes. The wind, once a mournful lament, now whispered tales of resilience, of a woman who had dared to mend not just machines, but the very architecture of her own fate. Agnes, the widowed woman of steel, had not only rebuilt her life, but in the process had forged a new path for her daughter, a legacy of competence, courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of practical application. The road ahead was long, but they were ready, two souls intertwined, driving towards a horizon brimming with the quiet promise of a life meticulously engineered for peace.